So next I would like to welcome my co-moderator. I can't see you. His name is Dave Keating. Please help me welcome Dave. Hello. How are you doing?
Good to see you.
I think in the UN, all of you greet like that. Okay, that's fine. So I'm hoping that our stagehands are going to set up for the panel now. Meanwhile, let's have a chat.
Yeah.
What was your takeaway so far?
Well, I think we've heard a lot, both this morning, a message of hope and a realistic assessment of where we are, right? So we know that we're not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals, and that a lot of work is going to be done. But at the same time, a lot of work is ongoing, right? We have made significant strides. So the next panel is going to basically take stock. Where are we? Where do we need to go? And how do we get there? And part of that is going to be looking at how we get there in an equitable way. One thing this panel is going to focus on is all of the really huge implications for people, for society, for the world of this energy transition, which is going to have a big impact on people. How do we make sure we reach our goals in a way that's fair and equitable to everyone?
That's brilliant, because it's just solution-orientated, and we're moving away from, dare I say, talking shop.
Yeah, we're trying.
Doing more than trying. Now, who are the individuals who you have on the panel? Are you going to tell us now, or are you going to introduce them after?
I won't keep you in anticipation any longer as we get the chairs out here. Let me tell you about our panelists. You guys can come on over and take a seat. So with us to discuss these issues, we have Damilola Ogunbiyi, who's CEO for Sustainable Energy for All, and a special representative of the UN Secretary General for SDG 7. She's also co-chair of UN Energy. We also have Rafael Grossi. Come take a seat here. They couldn't wait to applaud for you. You're very popular in the hall. We have Rafael Grossi, who's Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we have Helen Watts, who's the Executive Director of Student Energy, which is a network of young climate leaders. And Helen is also on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, I should point out. So welcome to all of you. I'm really excited to have this conversation because, like I was saying to Rita, we've heard about where we need to go, and it's a daunting challenge, right? We know that it's not going to be easy. And we also know that these changes that we're talking about are going to have big impacts on people. So how do we make these huge changes that are needed in a way that's fair for everybody? Let me start with an opening question for each of you with a little statistic to show that we can do it, that these things are achievable. So in 2022, the decarbonization of the power sector reached its lowest point, its lowest emission point intensity ever. And that's largely because of the big increase in renewable power and the growth in the wind and solar sector. So how can we sustain this decarbonization specifically in the power sector? And how is this a good example of what we can achieve when we really put our minds to it and when the market is working hand in hand with politicians? Damilola, I'll put that to you first.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to flip that question around because I come from the sector where dealing with people who don't even have markets and energy in the first place. So from my point of view, I think we need to obviously use less in the developed world, but we do have to pay special attention to the developing world, especially the African continent. So we are living in a world now that easily there are about 600 million people who have no access to electricity at all, and about 2.3 billion who have no access to clean cooking. So as we talk about these issues, we can't talk about achieving our climate goals and keep people in energy poverty. So in my point of view, things we have to do is basically, we need to invest in the developing countries. We need to invest in, not even look at it as an energy transition, because there's nothing they're transitioning out of. We have to look at it as a venture for green growth from the start. So we're not coming back in 20 years' time telling anybody to transition. We also need to recognize that at least the African continent that I'm from are a series of countries. It's not just one continent. So we have to see what are the different type of pathways when we tell those countries to get to net zero. I'm really glad we have Kande here from Sierra Leone. They're looking at what is their green growth plan. How do they get to net zero, but how do they develop at the same time? The same things, we've done programs in Nigeria, in Ghana, and the figures are staggering. So in my country, Nigeria, for Nigeria to say they're in a position to get to net zero by 2060, it's going to cost $1.9 trillion, of which 410 billion of that is above business as usual spending. I'm trying to put this in context because we keep on talking about COPs and raising 100 billion for the whole world. And we can see one country needs this amount of money. It's really important that we really focus on the investment and the finance needed. I'm really happy that USG Duarte is here because she's the guru on this on the continent. Because if we don't, and we don't take a serious look at countries that are saying they want to get to net zero, but they understand they need to develop as well, these figures will be insignificant. So I think it's really great. We are seeing decarbonization, but it's not moving fast enough. It's not for the whole of the world. It's for a few countries that have all the money to decarbonize if they really want to. Our focus should really be on countries who do not have the resources, but want to do the right things and basically are the climate victims right now.
That's a really good point, that for wealthy countries, we're talking about a transition, but for a large part of the world, we're actually talking about getting it right from the start, from development. Raphael, so when we're talking about power generation and decarbonization that's occurred there, obviously nuclear has a big role to play there. How does nuclear fit in with the decarbonization of the power sector and the energy changes more generally?
Well, first of all, great to be here. Thank you, DG Müller, for inviting us here. And what I like, and I think it goes to the heart of the question you are putting to us, is your emphasis, DG, on solutions here. I think it's very obvious when one looks at the reality of the world and what is happening in front of our eyes, that we need to do certain things or stop doing certain other things. And in spite of many things that are said, and I think we all agree on the fundamental diagnosis of the thing, the reality is that still fossil fuels is 80% and growing. It's not that it's stopping, it's not that it's slowing down. No, it's growing. So we need to have a dose of realism in what is really happening out there. Our perspective, of course, is nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, there are debates, there are narratives about it. What is the reality? The reality is that nuclear energy is one of the most efficient and important producers of clean energy today. Today, as we speak, we are here in Europe, half of the clean energy produced in this continent is nuclear energy today. Not a possibility, not something that could happen in the future. So what we are trying to do, our collaboration here is not to peddle nuclear energy per se, or for it, is to see how we can collaborate into what should be intelligent, integrated energy systems that point towards what you are saying, which is decarbonizing. There are countries that have decarbonized already today. You have France, you have Sweden, you have Ontario in Canada. How did they do it? Hydro and nuclear. Are we saying this is what everybody has to do? No. Of course, in energy, there is no such thing as one size fits all. That does not exist. What we say is that in many places in the world, nuclear energy is a great articulator. It's a baseline, solid, dispatchable, 24/7, 365, 65 days a year source of energy that can pair very well with renewable energies, can even enable them, because the intermittency of renewable energies is evident. They are good. We should have more of them, but we should have them in a way that allows for the electrification, for the needs that D.G. Müller and the very inspiring movie that we saw a few minutes ago are going to be demanding. So what's happening? What's happening is that this energy is growing, and there are new forms of it. D.G. Müller was referring to small modular reactors, for example, which are very interesting. I have a lot of interest. We see a lot of interest in developing countries. In Africa, for example, for small modular reactors. The reality is that with an SMR, as we call it in the jargon, you can power half of a middle-sized African country with clean energy. The road towards that requires a number of steps, requires a level playing field in terms of investment. And here we are familiar with very important debates that are taking place. In Europe, there was you had the debates about the taxonomy and things like this. But we see that overall there is a trend that is recognizing the enabling role of nuclear energy, as I said, in intelligent partnership with renewable energies, with hydro, with other forms of energy. So from the perspective, the small perspective, bureaucratic perspective, if you allow me, of the IEA, we are there to ensure that this happens in a safe way, in a secure way, and in a way that will not lead to nuclear weapons. So, and we are very happy to be here. We are going to be joining the family of energy efforts with Damilola and others, and of course Gerd in Dubai. It was very inspiring to hear from the president of the COP in these efforts. But to go back to my initial point and D.G. Müller's initial point, solutions. What we need are solutions, plans and very imaginative vistas of what could be. Yes, very nice, but we have a very serious problem. And we do have some very interesting tools that are being used right now, and that should be, of course, enabled. Ideology doesn't help. What helps is practical solutions to get to this decarbonized future. That is not an impossibility, but there are many things that we need to do right to get there.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, these legacy nuclear power solutions are controversial at the EU level. You referenced the taxonomy, controversial particularly for the country we're in, for other countries as well. Maybe we could come back to that in a bit.
Yeah.
Helen, let me turn to you next. So we know that young people are going to be the most affected by climate change. The younger a person is, the more affected they're going to be by it, right? How can young people take part in this transition? And particularly when we're thinking about the examples of success that we've seen so far, such as decarbonization of power generation, what's the role for young people to get involved there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thank you, Dave. And I want to kind of come back to what we're more often seeing in these kinds of spaces and at COP are these commitments from governments right now for energy transition plans or just energy transition plans that are working to kind of build out this trajectory 10 plus years down the line. Likewise, with climate commitments, we often see decarbonization or net zero goals extending to 2030, more often 2040, 2050. And so I want to pause there and then look at the demographics of youth around the world. We have about 1.8 billion young people around the world, so just about a quarter of our global population. 90% of them are living in the global south. And I think if you look inside of some of these spaces where these energy transition plans are being crafted and designed, or these climate commitments are getting mapped out and set, you won't see that proportion of 25% of young people in those spaces. And so for me, this question about how do we sustain progress on decarbonization really comes down to how we're getting this young generation involved. And critically, I think the 18 to 30-year-old range is so important for us to be engaging with right now. I think I've just come from 3 days of the Youth Solution Days, which was a fantastic initiative co-hosted by UNIDO and Sustainable Energy for All, which really platformed young people and brought together the community. And then I know young people are going to be platformed throughout this event. That's really critical because I actually hear from my youth community that more often than not, the only spaces where they can actually meet their own governments as it is in spaces like international conferences or COP. And so how we leverage spaces like this is absolutely critically important, but I do worry that sometimes we get kind of stalled at that point. And then outside of the event space, there isn't enough actually being done to ensure that when we go back home, we're continuing to embed and meaningfully include young people in these spaces. And I say meaningfully include young people because I do see still too often where kind of young people, I would say in particular kind of at spaces like COP or kind of other spaces are kind of brought on as an inspirational kind of note to share with an audience at the end of an event or an end of a session. Too often the same young people as well. And it's really, I think, disempowering for young people to not feel like, especially if you're not one of those people, to really feel like there isn't that clear pathway for how you can be part of designing solutions in a way where you have agency, where you're valued as young people. So for Student Energy, for my organization, we've been working for 15 years, and we've gathered extensive data and evidence on where the needs really exist from the perspective of young people, but also the perspective of industry and governments. And we've kind of built out our strategies to really line up with where we see the biggest gaps right now and where we're set up as a global NGO to really best kind of serve our key intervention point. One of them being around project-based learning. So we need young people to actually have opportunities through training, resources, mentorship to develop projects while they're still young with support systems to really give them that confidence and that skill set to take on projects. And I use the term projects. I know it's quite vague, and that's intentionally so. We need to support young people taking a variety and a diversity of different projects while they're still young, recognizing that young people are going to be best suited to, or where it's going to be most accessible to deliver certain types of projects. We really try and make sure that those projects are best fit, kind of most impactful in the context that they're in. So in a high emitting context, for example, that might look like an energy conservation or energy efficiency related project, or really pushing their governments on climate legislation. In contexts where energy access is still the greatest priority, this might look like supporting young people to take on a distributed renewable energy project or a household or micro scale grid system. And so that's really important because you give young people those tools, they develop critical skill sets, they really deeply engage with their communities to understand what the problems are and what the opportunities are. The other piece to this is workforce development. I think if we're getting serious about talking about sustaining work on decarbonization in an inclusive and equitable way, while also closing the massive gap that still exists on energy access, and not just energy access, but reliable, affordable energy access at a level that is ensuring a dignified life, we need to be supporting young people to move into decent work, as it's defined by the UN, where they can work on these issues in a well-supported way that also contributes to their own livelihood development and ultimately allows them to contribute back to their communities. So that workforce development piece is another key strategy that we take. I'll maybe pause there because I know more discussion to come.
Yeah, so on that very topic of making sure that development goals are going hand in hand with sustainable energy goals, Damilolo, so before you were with Sustainable Energy for All, you were the first female managing director of the Nigerian Rural Electrification Agency, where you initiated the Nigerian Electrification Project, which was a pretty big deal. So you have on-the-ground, hands-on experience with these types of issues. So tell me, how can we ensure that countries that have a low level of energy access, that we're really prioritizing that, but at the same time, we're aligning the decarbonization goals with the development goals?
Okay, great question. First, I think you have to understand that in a lot of the countries that energy access is a problem, energy development and climate are one of the same thing. It's the rest of the world that tries to decouple it. You know, there are development projects, especially when we were doing in Nigeria, giving access to clean energy to people was the same thing as development. And that brings me to the issue that I think we keep on looking at 2050 and not realizing that if we don't achieve our 2030 goals and we still leave, and I think the statistics is maybe 1 billion people won't have access to energy, that we think we're going to achieve our 2050 goals. So the 2030 goals are very, very critical. And as Sustainable Energy for All, we work with governments on what does your integrated energy plan look like. So I use Sierra Leone a lot because I keep on saying Kande, but where are the people who don't have access to electricity? What is the best way to provide them access? Where are the productive use spots, you know? And this is access to live a productive life, you know. I think that's what Helen was saying, not a minimum level of access. You know, for too long, we've infiltrated a lot of vulnerable countries with solar lanterns and clapped and said, you've left people with a dignified life. That is not a dignified life. That could be a solution for lighting, but it's not electrification. You have to have a minimum level of electrification. And we've been pushing strongly that that figure has to be about 1,000 kilowatt hours a year. Let me put that in perspective. Right here in Austria, it's about 5,000. America is about 13,000. So we're asking for 12,000 less than America. And you know, it baffles me when people are still in this kind of, you know, archaic, kind of backwards tier system of, because I have nothing, then I must have the absolute minimum of a couple of light bulbs, and then, you know, I've done something. I think fundamentally we need to shift because, you know, I use a statistic, and I mentioned it at the youth summit that Helen was talking about yesterday. The average African in sub-Saharan Africa is in energy poverty, right? If you take away South Africa, the installed capacity is about 440 kilowatt. It's nothing, right? So being born Black African like I was, I'm 20 times at a disadvantage than any other human being in the world. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about energy transition that is just and it's equitable and it's dignified. We're not talking about because I have nothing, I have minimum levels. And I think that's really, really important. And back to my background in Nigeria, when we negotiated the Nigerian electrification project, we thought by 2023 we would have, and Kevin Kariuki's here from AFDB, maybe 25 of these programs. We still have one, and we say it's a crisis. And the one we're talking about is $550 million. It's not a lot of money. There's not enough money going into energy access. Energy access, unfortunately, is not seen as a climate mitigation issue, which it should be. So for me, it's all about the money and the financing. It's been too long that the money's there somewhere, and we're not channeling through. Where's the money? Because I can tell you who needs the money. I can tell you the governments who already have the plans. I can show you the bankable projects as you put into it. But I think what we have to really look at ourselves, and you know, this forum is meant to be solutions driven, is where are the people in this conversation? It's people and planet. And if you think about the most vulnerable people, you will get the resources to them. But we just, it's all about finance, I guess, at the end of the day, and getting finance to be able to do these projects. Thanks.
So Raphael, I alluded earlier to the nuclear is a controversial subject in the EU, particularly whether or not new projects, these small nuclear reactors, for instance, should be incentivized. That debate is not limited to Europe. It's also taking place in Africa. It's taking place in the Americas, taking place in Asia.
Yes.
How do you see the challenges and opportunities for integrating nuclear power with all of this new renewable power coming into the system, and how should policymakers frame that so that the two things are working together in the best way?
Well, the first thing that we are seeing is that there is, in general, a return, what I call, some in the industry talk about like a nuclear renaissance. I don't like that term. I think there is a return to realism. What do we have? The cheapest way to continue producing clean energy is to extend the lifetime of existing nuclear power plants, for example. It's very cheap. They are there. The investment has taken place already. So you have them, and this is what is happening in, again, to refer to Europe, since we are in Europe, there are more than 100 nuclear power plants in Europe. Most of them are being extended because policymakers are realizing that this is giving them a solution. And many countries are increasing the existing capacity. Look at France, look at the whole of Eastern Europe, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, even Poland, which was the only country that did not have nuclear energy. Now they are having very ambitious programs in that regard. In the Global South, I just come from India. They have 23 nuclear power plants. They are building 8 more and planning 10 more. Not about China. China, 50-something, building 22, planning 10 more. India. And these are the places where you have the problem. When you look at the big, and again, Gerd was referring to the statistics. Where is the problem? And what is being done about it? And we're talking about a fraction, because when it comes to China, they have simply 5% of nuclear energy, and they want to get to 10 or 15. But there are many other countries. Turkey, the ambassador is there. Egypt. We are going to Dubai, aren't we? Who would have thought that in a place like the United Arab Emirates, you would need nuclear energy? And they have 4 nuclear power plants producing 25% of the energy that the country is producing. So it's a global phenomenon. So what we are trying to help, and in particular countries in developing countries, what we are trying to do is to go for the best mix possible. The IEA does something, including for the International Renewable Energy Organization. We do the modeling, the planning, which may or may not include nuclear energy, by the way, because we are not a lobby. We do the planning, we do the modeling, integrating in the best possible way, as I was saying, a nuclear component, which may be higher or lower, depending on the infrastructure that you have, etc. And in this, the IEA provides the training and other solutions. So what we are seeing is a very big phenomenon that includes small reactors and even micro reactors. You know that the cloud, we all know the cloud, for example. You know that the cloud consumes more energy than Japan? The cloud consumes more energy than Japan, all right? So many companies, including Microsoft and others, are looking into introducing micro reactors and small modular reactors just to power their data centers in a very fast way. So I think the challenge put in the way you put your question is one of integrating in an intelligent way, providing training for the new generations, providing the conditions that are going to facilitate this.
Helen, coming back to the issue of fair distribution of the energy transition and its effects, how does student energy approach this subject of the social and economic impacts of the energy transition? And how do you envision the best way to make sure you have an inclusive and just transition, as well as an environmentally effective transition?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it comes back to what Damilola just said about, where are the people? Making sure that as these plans are being designed, as these policies are being developed, you have the people who are going to be directly impacted by these policies, who are the most vulnerable, but also have huge amounts to offer, and bringing them into the design process as early on as possible. So that's something that we advocate for. I would say in terms of student energy's approach, I mentioned workforce development, I mentioned project-based learning. Those are kind of methods that we use. But something that I do hold kind of quite dear in our approach as an organization as well is that we're actually purely a demand-driven organization. And what I mean by that is we don't actually go out and recruit young people to join student energy's programs. We have about 8 different programs through our ecosystem. They're all targeted at kind of different stages that a young person might be at when it comes to engaging on energy and climate issues. Young people come to us, and so what is really magical about that is it becomes this kind of proof point of the peer-to-peer engagement model that is so important to actually mobilizing solutions at scale for the climate and energy challenge, is we need young people to feel like they have platforms where they're supported and valued and recognized, platforms that are ideally also offering pathways for them to have real agency in designing plans and projects. And what that really does is young people talk to other young people, talk to their community members, talk to their families, and get them involved in this conversation as well. And that's where you really start to see kind of the power dynamic shift, where young people and their communities that they're actively building with this kind of newfound or kind of revitalized confidence to feel like they can really take action in a meaningful way. They become this kind of critical mass of advocates for energy transitions and for just and inclusive energy transitions. We've seen through our own research, we led and developed the first Global Youth Energy Outlook that was launched in full just last year, and it surveyed 42,000 young people from 129 countries around the world. And what we saw resoundingly is that young people hold dear these values around gender equity, reduction of social inequities, energy sovereignty, energy dignity, just as important as a decarbonized energy transition. So as you're bringing more young people into these spaces of power, you're also supporting them and engaging their communities. You're just, in effect, building these values into the way that society is engaging on these issues, and it just becomes normal. We don't need to have these conversations anymore about segmenting out the social impacts or the justice-based approach, because it just becomes part of how we plan, how we design, how we move forward. And it applies to energy transitions really profoundly, but it applies to every other type of transition that we're talking about in addressing the climate crisis as well. So that's our approach, is really valuing young people and ensuring that their values are very much represented in how we advocate and the types of projects that we support them to lead. And as we support them getting into the workplace, which is beyond student energy, but into kind of industry, private sector places, public policy places, community roles, they're bringing those values into all of these different sectors, and it becomes this kind of fundamental generational value shift. So I would say that's our core approach.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask each of you about COP28. It's coming up in just 4 weeks. We heard from the minister earlier. Based on your experiences and what we just talked about, what would be your key recommendation to the leaders, the global community that's going to be gathered in Dubai in just a couple weeks? What is the key thing that you would want them to think about as they go through that COP summit? Demilola, we'll start with you.
That's a really easy question. I would want them to really consider bringing the developing world back into the conversation in a real sense. I think we spend a lot of time looking at emissions, and because some countries don't have the largest emission profiles, we push them along, but they could be at risk later on. So it's important that they're part of the conversation and the commitments that are made are actually actualized to actions. So I think this COP, we want to see what are the actions from the commitments instead of more commitments.
So don't ignore the heavy emitters rather. Bring them in because they can be key activists.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Raphael, what about you?
Well, the first thing is this return to realism. You know, I started as DG in December 2019. Was very close to what was to be COP25, the one that should have taken place in Chile, and they ended up in Madrid. And I remember I started beginning of December, and I said, well, I will go to the COP. And many of my advisors said, no, don't go to the COP. People at the COPs, they don't like nuclear. It's not going to be nice for you. Well, I went. And you know, now we have a nuclear pavilion at the COPs. So times are changing, as the song said so wisely. I think we have an existential problem if we believe what is being said by the IPCC, if we believe what the statistics are telling us, and what we need to do is to go to the toolbox and take the tools that we have. Stop about ideological, strange, and false narratives. Look at the facts, use the solutions we have, and integrate them in an intelligent way. For the first time, And here I conclude. For the first time at the COP, the countries that are using nuclear energy are going to say it clearly. For us, it's important. We are facing a challenge, and this is part of our solution. And we are there to facilitate and to talk to others and to work with others.
It's interesting what you say about how much the COPs have changed. I've been going to them for 15 years.
Isn't it?
It's a totally different animal than it was.
Absolutely.
It's a much wider group of people, right? Everyone's involved. The table is bigger. Some people don't like that, but others say, actually, it's really good to get everyone involved. Helen, what about you? Every year at these COPs, we have young people there trying to make their voices heard. What do you think is the key message young people want the delegates to hear in Dubai?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to one of my points just about really ensuring that you're not falling into the trap that I'm seeing more and more of engaging young people in this really surface level way. And I think COP is kind of a right place for that because there's just so many people there. Like you said, this COP will be double in size from last COP. And that's just even more of a window, and maybe this is me just sounding quite cynical, but even more of a window for young people to kind of get propped up as these, again, hopeful beacons or inspirational voices, or even like a direct call to action, because I think that's often asked from young people now too, and then kind of shuffled out of the room to make space for other folks. So that's my one of my calls to action is to really question and interrogate how you're engaging young people in the COP space in a really meaningful way. And with a lot of young people that I've even heard from in the last few days saying, kind of reaffirming that that's the only space where I actually see my own governments. This is the perfect platform coming up in less than a month for governments who are going to COP to take seriously meeting with young people in a real value-driven way where you're recognizing their contributions and taking seriously what they have to say and then following that up outside of the COP space as well. On a more personal level, I mean, something that I'm seeing quite a lot in the youth climate community more largely right now is this kind of resurgence around climate legislation. We've seen only about 17 countries, as of 2022 at least, who actually committed their net zero commitments into legislation, and without legislative accountability, I struggle to think of how we will actually get back on track. Again, I don't want to sound too cynical, but I really feel like that's a tool in the toolbox that is very much readily available, particularly for developed economies, to actually commit their climate commitments into legislation and build accountability into the way that we talk about climate. Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for this opening discussion. I want to thank the panelists for some really interesting insights. How about a round of applause for them?
Thank you very much.
And now I'm going to turn it back over to Rita, who is somewhere probably behind me. Here she comes. And we can step off this way.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful contributions. Before you go, Dave, now can you just tell us in a nutshell what a key takeaway was from this panel?
I mean, I think what we really heard is that there is a roadmap to making sure that the transition is fair and just to everyone. And I think we really heard some key points there from Damilola about making sure that even the small emitters are kept on board during the COP discussions, because you get all those small emitters together. They're big emitters, and then they are also big activists. They can make their voice heard. We've seen that actually happen at a lot of COPs in the past, where you have these smaller countries grouping together. It's happened before where they group together with the European Union, and they can achieve major things. So that's, I think, was a message of optimism for the upcoming COP28 in Dubai.
Yeah, you have to have that. And together we are forced to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Good.
Dave. See you later.